is my good Friday morning, and welcome to another edition of the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist. My name is Tim, and I will be your host this week. My goal is to smother you with information about a fast-growing smothering plant, the kudzu. Last week, we brought you an episode on an aggressive monster from the north, the Hodag, and this week, we're bringing you an episode on an aggressive monster of the south. Those of us in the upper Midwest or New England or Sri Lanka probably don't have much familiarity with this monster. Actually, Sri Lanka maybe. Uh, but for those of us in the U.S., you familiar with this either from hearing about it, or if you've migrated to or from, or traveled to or from, or spent any time in the area where kudzu reigns royal. It has a crazy story, super cool. As a plant, it's a super legume with all of the accompanying adaptations. And so we're gonna hear about some of these stories right now. So if you can, please sit back and relax. Comfy chair, get a warm beverage, uh, get all hygge, maybe wear a nice flannel like Eric, and get otherwise comfy in front of the warm glow of your device's screen as we bring you episode XXX of season 6 of The Backyard Naturalist. There will be kudzu. And first, as I love to do every week, I'd like to just personally thank each and every one of you for being here today. Whether you're here with us live on Friday morning or you're joining us later, watching this recorded, and especially if you're watching this later recorded, I'm happy you're here and I'm happy to be spending this time with you. And I have an extra happy thanks for those of you who have joined us as any of the levels of subscribers. And if you are a super subscriber, you know that you can sign up for free for one of our Green Spaces Familiar Faces programs where smiles are guaranteed, even for Eric. And the next familiar face to lead a program is Rita Flores Wiskowski, a co-leader of the Milwaukee chapter of the BIPOC Birding Club of Wisconsin, and just an all-around great human being. So she will be taking us to one of her and my favorite local green spaces, the kind of hard to believe it's urban Havenwood State Forest. And you can join us on April 26th at 8 a.m., much later than Chuck Hagner's start. And again, this is free for super subscribers, open to anyone. We'd love for you to join us. And then a few days after Rita's trip, we are heading back up to Plover, Wisconsin. What an aptly named town to see one of the natural wonders of Wisconsin, which is the lek of the greater prairie chicken. So, in my opinion, life is too short to go through it without seeing this incredible display at least once. And then finally, I'd like to give a shout out to some of my go-to sources, my regular go-to sources of facts for many of these episodes, including this one. So, Stuff You Should Know, the podcast, How Stuff Works, and Mental Floss, all wonderful and worth it as wasters of time, primarily because of the knowledge gained. So, here we are talking about kudzu. And first and foremost, we're going to look at it from a naturalist point of view. So it is a plant. Obviously, it is a vascular plant, a flowering dicot in the rose clade and the Fabalis order. It gets all kind of jumbled up here. It's not the straight up kingdom phylum class. This includes the order includes the legumes and things with cool names like soapbarks and milkworts. And but more specifically, it is a legume. It's a classic legume in the family Fabaceae, so it has all those wonderful legume qualities. And we've featured at least one legume, probably more, here on the Backyard Naturalist. We had a nice episode on beans, which I'm very familiar with, and beans and kudzu are very closely related. They follow each other down this classification system all the way through family and subfamily, and they don't break off from each other until they hit the genus level. And but even with this, it's quite complicated even to call something kudzu, because kudzu is part of a genus. So there's a few species in the genus Pueraria. There's actually 20 species in this genus, all native to southern and eastern parts of Asia. as well as getting down into New Guinea and northern Australia. Um, but there's only a few species in this genus that we call kudzu. So there's not a specific kudzu plant, but if you go to the south of the US, there is a specific species that we call kudzu. Um, the etymology in this genus uh, is pretty straightforward because it's named after a person, the Swiss botanist Nicholas Porari. A lot of vines and lianas. Lianas are woody vines and shrubs. And again, classic legumes characterized also by large tuberous roots and found in a bunch of different habitats. So in that kind of tropical subtropical zone, and the subtropical part is why it takes roots in the southern part of the US, which is a subtropical zone. So this specific one is not our kudzu. This is a tropical kudzu, also called puero, native to Australia. And you can start to immediately see the kind of classic legume characteristics, the pea flower. And this is one of the three species in this genus that are considered kudzu. And but for all intents and purposes, in this lecture, kudzu refers to the specific species, which even at this level is not super straightforward because the species is Pueraria montana, not because it's found in Montana, because it's a mountain, and even though this is a species, there's a ton of subspecies. The other species of kudzu, there's hybridization, and it's likely even that the kudzu here in the south has ancestry from several of the kudzu, at least more than one of the kudzu species. So it's a complicated relationship, a lot of hybridization, a lot of intentional species or subspecies in the gardening and medicinal. So humans have been messing with them and creating new varieties. And so, like the guinea pig and other things, it's a very complicated phylogenetic relationship. Um, but we can also just say we're going to call it Pueraria montana as the kudzu of the southern U.S. But you can get into the weeds of that actual ancestry. It's kind of fun. Um, so this is a perennial vine known as the vine that ate the South. And so as such, it is the stuff of legends, of rumor, of hearsay, of tall tales, and like the Hodag in the North, has kind of become part of the identity of the South. Uh, and again, I'm speaking as a Northerner representing the South. So if anybody has any, this is the opinion of the resources that I found and some personal experiences. And the true origin, as I mentioned, is somewhat complicated, but essentially, the kudzu here in the U.S. is native to parts of China and Japan, and as the stuff of legends and tall tales and blue oxes, here are some real facts for you to chew on, some game-changing facts. So, under peak growing conditions, kudzu can grow about a foot a day. 1 foot every day. So you wake up in the morning, you see where the plant is, you go to bed at night, and it's quite a bit farther than it used to be. We have Tree of Heaven that doesn't get nearly it's also an aggressive grower, but not quite to this level. And a single plant in one growing season in the southern U.S. can easily grow 60 feet in that season. So, and that just accounts for the length. It doesn't account for all the other growth that it does literally on the side. And as a perennial herb in the south, the southern winters aren't enough to kill back that above ground vegetation you often do get with perennials. So essentially, under most conditions, kudzu is just a growing machine that really does take over quickly and quietly. And as of yet, as we were talking about earlier, it can't survive our winters up here. So it's still a truly southern plant. As with the beans, and in our bean episode, we looked a lot about how amazing they are at growing and how some of these plants almost display what we could think of as sentience and awareness of its surroundings. the kudzu is no less than the other beans in finding ways to grow using those long, thin tendrils to kind of explore the surroundings and just growing the heck out of itself. So they'll wrap those tendrils around whatever they want to, anything living, non-living, other kudzu, and they do it quickly. And almost you could see it in real time. Certainly, you could see it in with cameras. Um, but so this kind of brings us to the really fun images of kudzu in action. It's kind of hard not to just make this a slideshow of kudzu pictures because there's so many really fun ones. But the tendrils might, like I said, wrap around other kudzu like it's doing here. Um, can make quick work of fences, uh, quick work of guy wires leading to houses. This can be a problem. Electricity or phone wires. We have a little bit of an issue here with our grapevines and the neighbors' hops, but again, nothing like this. They will easily get onto a tree limb and then swallow up entire trees. And I think this image is probably closest to what my first image of kudzu, and probably for many, their first image of kudzu is usually on a roadside highway, and you just kind of see it like a blanket covering up an entire forest edge. And if your mind could easily go to like a fable land with magic creatures and just kind of this gentle slope carpet of kudzu. Again, it's easier for your mind to go to um, as it's swallowing up an entire forest edge. And you neglect your barn for even a little while, you return and you'll see the kudzu carnage, or maybe you paid good advertising money for a billboard and you got to do some upkeep before the kudzu completely usurps your marketing. But essentially, pretty much kudzu can grow just about anywhere and everywhere, including the worst, barren, eroded, nasty soils. In fact, disturbed areas are where it's at its best. And in part because they are early successional species that in their natural world thrive with disturbances, and they have an additional shared adaptation with quite a few other invasive aggressive species, which is a large, maybe humongous taproot. And we were talking about the taproots and dandelions being pretty rough. This is a pretty big taproot, and in a mature kudzu, they can easily reach 12 feet long, going a couple feet above basketball hoop, weighing 400 pounds. And this is one of the reasons of its success and lasting power is that it just stores a tremendous amount of energy in that taproot. So regardless of what's going on in the surrounding soils and the temperatures, it's got this battery pack in the middle that allows it to spread in even the worst soils as it stores what it needs in this big taproot. But maybe even more importantly than that taproot, or equally importantly, is that in addition to that taproot, anytime that growing kudzu vine reconnects with the soil, which could be every foot in some conditions, that plant can send out a supplemental root, a root ball. It's called a root crown. And so you have from this one vine, all of a sudden you have a new root crown. And then from that root crown is going to grow a new vine. And then each of these vines are establishing more root crowns. So it's exponential, right? It's like, trying to map the the progeny of mouse, and the mice young are having more grandbabies and grandbabies. That's basically what's happening is it's spreading, but it's spreading exponentially. It's like that fractal pattern. And so just creating new growth everywhere. Um, and then the the vine producing vines, that kind of meta growth, quickly can establish a tangled mass of a thicket that can be up to 10 feet thick. So, I've got nightmares of falling into quicksand, which we've covered here, or sand, or I guess maybe in the north you have the terrible prospect, if you're a farmer, of falling into a silo full of corn or getting swallowed by different tidal pools or something, but you could literally get swallowed up by kudzu thicket. You know, it'd be like being up a creek without a paddle, but if you're in a kudzu thicket without a machete, that might be even worse. And I don't think most of us are 10 feet tall, so could literally swallow you up with that meta growth. And a single vine just becoming quickly a tangle of hundreds of vines very quickly. So kudzu can be this raging maniac, which it is known for, and there is a little bit of a lighter side to the story. So this is kudzu in the Americas. This is like the gremlins after midnight, right? This is an aggressive, invasive species, but it's not native to here. So in its native habitat, the the kudzu is in a much greater system of checks and balances. It's there's predator prey, there's competition, and carrying capacity, and all those other healthy parts of an ecosystem that keep them under check. So it doesn't mean that kudzu can't become aggressive in in the native habitat. It's a specialist for disturbances, so it can. But again, it's a member of a healthy plant community, and it has those checks and balances that kind of even things out. Super useful to the human species that have been evolving with it for thousands of years. And there's entirely too many uses for kudzu to get into here, but produces notably, it's also known as arrowroot. So if you've heard of arrowroot tea or soup, this is another name for kudzu, and it can be just enjoying, in your higa, or it can be a medicine, aiding with things like digestion and colds and soups. So a ton of culinary uses. Japanese cultures in particular grind the root into a powder for use as a food and a food additive. So popular items like mochi, which is one of my absolute favorites, and noodles are made with that ground kudzu root as a thickener. It's full of flavonoids, which gives it medicinal properties and is known to have protection qualities for things like cardiovascular disease, inflammation, osteoporosis. So again, in the old world, in it is an important cultivated plant that somewhere along the line, and we'll explore that too, it made its way to the U.S. where it became that monster. And even that story has become a little bit of a legend of the lore. And so if you talk to, again, apparently, if you talk to people in the South who there is this culture, I don't know if you call it a bubbler culture or just a hanging out culture or whatever, but apparently it's something a lot of people in the South like to talk about as part of their identity. Um, and I said the same thing about the folks up in Rhinelander last time, but a lot of folks will tell there. So there's a lot of not super accurate stories being told. One that has a bit of accuracy is that people will say that it was brought to the US in 1876 as part of the World's Fair, which it was. It was part of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. There was a very popular kudzu exhibit. And then for some people, that's where the story begins. And then from there, it spreads everywhere. So again, while part of this is true, there was this exhibit. It was very popular. It was displayed as a miracle vine, but apparently the kudzu from that exhibit was destroyed at the end of the fair. So it's not the origin story of kudzu, but people still tell this one. But because of the popularity of this exhibit, people in the United States wanted kudzu of their own, and so pretty soon kudzu was made available to folks in the U.S. by mail order, and people could order the seeds, plant them as ornamentals, plant them, kind of like you do with English ivy or something like that. The flower has a pleasant purple color, and the smell is described as a mix of grape candy and lavender. And so, according to others, this was the origin of kudzu taking over the South, as people just wanted it as a landscaping plant and it escaped. But apparently, this is also not the case because In this case, people were planting it as an ornamental plant, growing upright or on trellises or on porches, and so the vine didn't really have the opportunity to expand, and people were controlling it. Um, so even though these events were bringing kudzu to the U.S., that's not technically what's looked at as the origin of the problem. The Because again, in these situations, it is fairly easy to control. But when it's not easy to control, as we as mentioned earlier, is when it gets outside and gets to the ground and starts spreading with all of those little root packets. So in the 1930s, there were some areas that's when the Dust Bowl was ravaging some areas of the Great Plains. And in the South, there were also a lot of agricultural problems that were more the result of just poor management, the monoculture culture, and you have decades of monoculture crops of particularly corn, tobacco, and cotton, and that resulted in the soil on most of those farms being destroyed. Similar to look at even like rainforest, super productive, but once you start to break up that soil, a rainforest, a super productive rainforest soil could just become barren, and that's what also happened in the South. Severe erosion, severe nutrient depletion, and this. Not to mention, of course, the absolutely brutal and inhumane social systems that fueled these plantations. So, in the face of soil degradation everywhere, in 1933, what was initially known as the Soil Erosion Service, which later became the Soil Conservation Service, they started to promote kudzu as an answer to this soil devastation. So the country had already learned about kudzu, knew as a nitrogen fixer. Um, it could grow vigorously, and so it seemed like a pretty quick and good fix for even the poorest soils to get the kudzu in there to start replenishing and repairing and rejuvenating the soil. And there certainly is something to that for sure. And just a quick aside, we often group the nitrogen fixers in plants, and particularly the legumes. But it is important to note that all plants fix nitrogen. It's not just the legumes. The process of nitrogen fixation happens when plants bring sugar down to their roots to basically cultivate a population of microbes, and the microbes feed on the plant sugars, and it's the microbes that convert atmospheric nitrogen, which is not available to the plant, to a form of a usable form of nitrogen that the plants can take up. And so again, all plants do this, but it's the nitrogen fixers are like the superpowers of that world. They do it way better. They do it at a much higher volume, more efficiently. They have these huge microbial communities, and the net nitrogen fixation is way higher. They put out way more nitrogen than they use. That's not the case for all plants. Um, so again, all the plants do it. The legumes just do it way better. And and so they're from an agricultural perspective, from a land management perspective, they're really good at healing soil, legumes in general, and they're adding important depleted nutrients. And kudzu and other legumes are also, when they establish, they're slowing erosion. So again, the concept it makes sense. It's really good to help with the soil. And soon after, they began touting the benefits of, soon after the Conservation Service began touting the benefits, other government agencies also got on board, and they're acquiring millions of seeds, growing the seeds into seedlings, and distributing them widely in the South for people, especially farmers, to help replenish the devastated soil. And farmers were paid $8 an acre to plant kudzu. And by the 1940s, you have 3 million acres of farmland planted with kudzu, which is absolutely huge. And also, at about the same time, you have FDR's New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and hiring unemployed folks to help them spread kudzu as one of the projects far and wide. And instead of farmlands, the CCC is planting them along roadways, along railways, because roadways and railways also have erosion problems. A gully by a railroad bed is a problem. So helping with the railways, helping with the roadways, also making it's a a subjectively pretty plant. So maybe instead of looking at gravel or whatever, you're looking at this nice carpet of kudzu. So it seems like at the time a win-win-win situation for everybody. Um, but it wasn't an accident. It wasn't an accidental release. It was brought on purpose in massive numbers by the government and then spread. And again, it's important to remember that the areas of planting are farmlands, roadsides, and railways. And it wasn't just the government. There were other entities, people, organizations that were extolling the virtues of planting kudzu. And one of those people, probably the Johnny Appleseed of kudzu, Johnny Kudzu Seed, was a man by the name of Channing Cope. He was a farm editor for the Atlantic Constitution newspaper back when we had farm editors in newspapers, and an author. And he had a very popular radio show called Channing Cope's Almanac, which when I kind of looked into it, it seems more like a podcast or what we would consider a podcast today. Essentially, he would broadcast his radio show from his front porch and essentially just riff from the hip, and no planned script, just kind of talk for an hour. And a lot of people really enjoyed listening to him. And he used both his radio column or I'm sorry, his newspaper column and his radio station to spread the gospel of kudzu, basically, and repeatedly talking about how good it is for replenishing and rebuilding soil, and also mentioning how important and the huge potential for cattle grazing. So you've got all this farmland that's currently, that has been wasted and now is being replenished by the kudzu. So it seems like there's this almost too good to be true heavenly combination, because you have kudzu that once established is just going to grow like crazy. Then you have this what seemed like an endless supply of food for cows. So win-win. Like just it could be like just let it loose and the system just works itself out. The plant grows, the cows eat. Um, and so Cope forms the Kudzu Club of America, grows to 20,000 members at its heyday. And this is kind of peak kudzu, right? There's so much that it's done. There's so much potential. And of course, this is when the reality of the system start to sink in, the unknown, unthought of consequences, and the stark reality. So it starts slowly, and because the cattle system doesn't work. It works in theory, but the problem is that cattle are really good grazers. And so the cattle can continue to eat. The problem is from the kudzu side, they can't keep up with all of that constant grazing. So it was much easier for the cattle to basically, kill off the kudzu population, which, later we find will be a good thing. But at the time, the farmers that are like, hey, I have this wonderful system set up, it didn't work. The kudzu could not keep up with the cattle. Um, and it's not to say that like with future planning they could develop a system, but it never did. And then the other big problem that farmers started to realize, like oh crap kind of problem, is that this kudzu is pretty aggressive, and if not actively managed, could become a problem real quick. So it just takes a little bit of a lapse in vigilance, and the kudzu starts to invade the farmer's property, their equipment, the tractors, the yards, their buildings, their machinery. So it just becomes like a very long, slow horror movie of the plants taking over. And while this was for sure bad for farmers, but kind of fun for us, we get to look at the pictures of this devastation from the comfort again of our screens. So it wasn't just the farms that became, neglected farms, but we can kind of start to look at some of the pictures. And, if you're ever looking for some time to kill, this is a fun rabbit hole of images to look at on the webs. But basically, kudzu just taking over buildings. Now, this is in the old world. So just a reminder that yes, kudzu can do that also, and again in disturbed areas like towns. But yeah, it's kind of fun to look through all the pictures. And it's not just farmers that were affected. So escaped or planted kudzu quickly made their way into forests, and then it now starts to become a problem for the timber industry. And so in 1953, the dominoes that had been building for 20 years started to fall one by one, in the 20 years since the government intervention. And so now the USDA officially lists in 1953 maybe one of the gentlest of the upcoming pretty bad labels that it's about to give it. So the first one is that they removed kudzu from the approved cover type. So they didn't say it was bad, but they said it's not an approved cover type. Then in 1962, the Soil Conservation Service, which was the early cheerleader, reversed course and said, don't plant kudzu. They said if you're in a really remote area, that's fine, but don't plant it anywhere else. Then you get to 1970, and it was officially designated as a weed. And then it wasn't until 1997 that it was listed as a noxious weed. Um, and by this time, it's been long enough that people have realized the problems that it is being controlled and eradicated primarily by farmers, but it still has been and is a big problem in forests. And the thing about southern forests is when you look at the North American, eco types and plant communities, this is one of the most biodiverse environments. They're subtropical, and there's a tendency towards higher diversity as you get towards the equator, and also just from a North American, geologic history, this is the area where kudzu is south of the lobes of the last glaciers. So, the glaciers when they came down and retreated kind of did a reset of most forms of life, but this area was not affected, and so both because it's in the subtropics and because of that geologic history, these are the really biodiverse forests of North America. There's other places and other factors, but this is one of them. So there's so much kudzu at this point. There's more acreage of kudzu than any other legume for sure, more kudzu than soy. It's a close relative. And to to this day, our understanding of kudzu is still not very clear for a bunch of reasons, which include shady statistics, observer bias, and the results of the nitrogen fixation process itself. Because again, legumes are so good at nitrogen fixation, and if you have this new monstrous growing legume that's introduced in ecosystem, you are going to have effects like you're pulling at a string or adding something to a recipe. So without a doubt, the normal nitrogen cycle, which is pretty important, of the South is affected and disrupted. There's evidence that this excess of nitrogen coming back to the atmosphere might be bad for the air. So nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide, both of the outputs are known pollutants. And a 2010 study by Hickman et al. Suggested that these outputs of nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide are likely raising ozone levels, and so kudzu is decreasing air quality, and so that has the environmental effect, but it also exacerbates from the human health perspective things like asthma and lung inflammation. So on the flip side, because so much kudzu has been planted and established along roadsides and highways, there was a 2023 study that suggested that in the massive numbers along highways, kudzu are trapping and sequestering car emissions, which is helping with air pollution. So, as in any decent system and complicated system, there's the good and bad applications, even just in terms of air quality. But we do know that from an ecological perspective, it is pretty much all bad. And the other thing and the kind of fun thing that muddies this kudzu situation is that, apparently there is this weird fascination and pride around kudzu. It's becoming an identity in the South, according to some again. So like to talk about it. Not that they like it, but they like talking about it. Like, walking uphill to school both ways, a hardship that Southerners have to live through that bond them, a kind of pride in the problem. And because of this, you get you get the facts thrown around that may have no basis in reality, but are based on what people are saying. So, it's these unquestioned, unfiltered rumors that spread like kudzu, and the stories themselves become the kind of the bona fides around which this weird pride is born. And so the ownership of this pride results in these tall tales and statistics that are just repeated. And you do get some local emblems of this pride, like kudzu dyed T-shirts. There's a big crafting culture around kudzu. There are real facts and realities, like utility companies spending astronomical dollars, like hundreds of millions of dollars every year to control their equipment. The highway department also spends not hundreds of millions, but certainly millions of dollars on kudzu control. So certainly it's not only a cultural and biological thing, but it's an economic force as well. In 2009 is the first observation of the kudzu bug, which is a type of stink bug that's first observed in the United States. We're not sure how it got here. There's no, we can't think of an event that would have been released that would have released them, at least on purpose. So it got here probably by accident. Like other examples of biological control, it's being from the same area of the world as kudzu. They're a good kudzu predator, and a mature population of kudzu bugs can basically decimate a mature kudzu stand in about 2 to 3 years. So, as an application, they are good for kudzu control. However, like most introduced species, there are some big problems because it's not just eating the kudzu, it's eating a lot of other things, and they are also added to the growing list of bugs that like to overwinter in people's homes. Like with all the ladybugs and the other stink bugs and the box elder bugs and there. So kudzu is a big problem, no doubt. And as part of this culture, again, apparently you probably get an overinflated sense of just how bad the problem is, for all the reasons I talked about earlier. And there is a selection bias at play because humans tend to be in areas where kudzu is a problem more often than they are in areas where kudzu isn't a problem. So, like farmers and agencies have done a decent job of controlling kudzu from agricultural fields in some natural areas, but they're still left, pretty much unchecked along interstates, and people are on the interstates a lot, and so they see the kudzu a lot, and so you do get this overinflated sense of how bad the problem is, and along with the fact that people cite statistics pretty much willy-nilly and uh, based on what they hear. And often these statistics are on very shaky ground. And one of the most often cited statistics is that kudzu covers 7 million acres in the South. That's a lot of acres. That's bigger than the state of Vermont by quite a bit. That 7 million acre figure, according to a Smithsonian article, basically became common knowledge because it was repeated a lot. And so the origins of that story are very shaky ground. According to the article, it came from a garden club guide, a craft book, and a culinary and healing guide, but never really checked or substantiated. Yet, even the academic community continues to use that 7 million acre number, and so it's a thing. It's the thing. How much kudzu? 7 million acres. And how do you know? Because everyone knows. So there is a very, very likely that number is way inflated. We do have actual numbers, or I should say more accurate estimates from the U.S. Forest Service that say there's about 227,000 acres of Forest Service land that is contaminated with I'm not sure if it's Forest Service land or just forest. Either way, that number is going to be low since you'd have to extrapolate, and again, most of the kudzu is not in forest. But when you do those estimates, that the acreage of true kudzu is likely well below that 7 million acre number. Um, but that might raise the ire of some. Uh, and kudzu isn't even the worst offender as far as invasive species are concerned in the South. In the state of Alabama, there's 60,000 acres of kudzu in forests, but Chinese privet covers 1 million acres, and Japanese honeysuckle covers 3 million acres. So, and that's just Alabama. So, again, not to discount the negative effects of kudzu, but there's two other invasive species that apparently are way more of a problem than the kudzu. And as monstrous as kudzu is or appears, it isn't the most difficult to control invasive species out there. I mean, it's a huge chore for sure, but it was fairly easily contained. It is fairly easily contained with vigilance. And I mean, if cows can do it, it you know, it is possible to get rid of it, uh, in a year or two, which is relatively short when you're talking about really, noxious weeds. Um, so, the cattle can get rid of it. If you don't have cattle and you don't want to graze yourself, you could do what the city of Knoxville is doing and enlist your local goat herd to work on um, the kudzu and fertilize your soil. And if you don't like that option, you could also, or don't have that option, you could just mow the heck out of it. And if you're mowing that above ground vegetation consistently and regularly, eventually those root crowns will die off, and then that eventually will affect that big taproot. So that's why the cattle system didn't work. The cattle were too good, and you can basically do what the cattle did and with your lawnmower, and that's one way of getting rid of kudzu. The other method is to do what land managers do all the time, which is an herbicide. You cut the thickest part of the vine closest to the ground and apply the herbicide. Usually you might need 3 coats to kill it, but again, it's a relatively fast method. Pretty much all of these methods can work with applications in a year or two. You can also dig up the root crowns, which are much shallower and easier to work with than the root balls, which are the crowns, which are easier to dig up than the taproot. Excuse me. Um, and then the taproot will eventually go too. And while you're treating kudzu, you can embrace the kudzu culture. There are many resources out there on how to make crafts with kudzu, how to forage on kudzu. There's a new kind of southern hit cuisine based on foraging, which is, other parts of the world too. And kudzu is a big part of that. And at the end of his podcast, Josh reads a poem on kudzu that I'm going to at least recite part of it for you. So it's in books, it's in movies, and one of the most famous REM covers, Murmur, shows a train trestle outside of Athens that was covered in kudzu and became kind of a mecca for REM fans. And that trestle eventually was destroyed by the kudzu. Kudzu retains moisture. That's not good for the wood, and so they had to tear down the trestle, but they've rebuilt it. There's a replica of that trestle that's part of a hiking trail that people can still visit. And yeah, so that's the kudzu. It's a solid legume with legume properties. This is, you can see this looks just like edamame pods. That, it's a good bean. It's a good legume, and in addition to the other advantages of being a legume as a plant, as a biological specimen, it's adapted to extremely fast growth, early successional species. So you can imagine kudzu in its natural areas, just kind of moving along, being a kudzu, hanging out and waiting for a disturbance, a landslide, a tree fall, a gap, and then it's the kudzu's time to shine. And we have that too here. Certain grasses and vines and even like birch trees are good at disturbed areas, but are going to disappear or be held back if as they mature. And yeah, so you know, but in the U.S., all of these great adaptations minus the normal healthy control mechanisms that are in place in the native areas, that's a big problem. So easier for us here in the north to admire from afar. And maybe we're just a bit jealous that we don't have the kudzu to gripe about. Regardless, I'm gonna this is a 1963 New Yorker magazine poem called Kudzu, written by James Dickey, who also wrote Deliverance. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long, but I will share it with you. So, Japan invades, far eastern vines run from the clay banks they are supposed to keep from eroding, up telephone poles which rear half out of leafage as though they would shriek like things smothered by their own. Green, mindless, unkillable ghosts in Georgia. The legend says that you must close your windows at night to keep it out of the house. The glass is tinged with green. Even so, as the tendrils crawl over the fields, the night the kudzu has your pasture, you sleep like the dead. Silence has grown oriental, and you cannot step upon ground. Your leg plunges somewhere it should not. It never should be. Disappears and waits to be struck. And the poem goes on. So, thank you for joining. That's Kudzu. We have a very special guest next week, and I will stop sharing my screen.